Aloha, my name is Dr. Mellisa Yee from Seeds of Truth. We are here today to discuss a very important topic, which is our food and our environment. Many of us are not aware that so many changes are occurring, although we do see them with the volcano eruptions, the forest fires, but we don't think about our food because we always believe that it's going to be there when we want it. But as so many have warned us before, that if there is an emergency, Hawaii doesn't have a very big supply which will sustain us for the 14 days that we would need in case of a disaster. So therefore, we need to look at this topic more clearly and closely because the natural disasters are occurring more and more, and we have to be prepared for what's coming in the very near future. Today I have as my guest Dr. Jonathan Latham, who is from Ithaca, New York, and he is here doing a round of talks about the environment and our concern for the development of genetic engineering, which is called gene drives. And he's going to explain a little bit more about that. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Latham.
Hi, Melissa.
Hi there. How are you today?
Oh, I'm having a great day. Thank you. I went for a swim.
Oh, it's very excellent that you catch it right before the hurricane comes. So I'd like you to just talk a little bit about your background, your educational background, your professional background, and what brought you here to Hawaii.
Yeah. So I am a molecular biologist by training. So I have a master's degree in crop science. So my bachelor's was basically botany. They called it plant science, but it was botany. And then I did a PhD in virology, plant virology. And in the course of that, I used to make GMO crops, and they were not for commercialization. This is merely doing the same procedures, but using them for experimental purposes. So we were testing viral gene functions by putting them into plants, and then I did medical research for 3 years. So I became a little disillusioned with that genetic engineering approach. And the initial reason was that it seemed pretty clear we weren't doing it for the benefit of farmers or consumers, right? It was for the benefit of breeding companies. And we didn't talk to farmers. And so I became a little worried that this was not going to be useful to those people, right? If you're not at the table, you're part of the menu. Mm-hmm. And so these people were not at the table. So it was problematic on several levels, and we had conversations in the lab too about risks. There were people, molecular biologists, genetic engineers, who were doing experiments that they did think would lead to new crops, and we thought they were risky, some of them.
I see. Were these at universities or independent laboratories?
They were mostly at universities. Because at that time, this is between 1991 and 1996, there was basically nothing on the market. So we didn't really know what Monsanto was going to come up with, and these other companies were going to come up with. But we could see researchers making products, making GMO crops, that if they were put on the market, as they were claiming they would intended to do, that would have been deeply problematic to us.
So you say that you became quickly disillusioned, and what was it that you were observing that you didn't quite resonate with?
I mean, in part it was the reductionism. In part it was just who is at the table, and in part it was I always wanted to be an ecologist, right? And when I left my undergraduate studies, I had a professor who's kind of my mentor, and he said, if you study ecology directly, you will basically end up as an accountant. You will not get a job. And so, I don't like accountancy. It's not my thing. I'm virtually mathematically illiterate, certainly dyslexic. And I so I did molecular biology, right? And it wasn't my inclination, but it turned out it was an interesting training, and I learned a tremendous amount about what it means to be a reductionistic scientist. That stood me in good stead. You know, maybe we'll get to talk about some of those issues, and I talked about them in Manoa a little bit, about the kind of genetic fixation of our society, and I mentioned a few of the implications of that, but there are many others that I didn't have time to go into. But basically, you know, the talk I gave, I was at a conference at called the Sustainable Agriculture Education Association, and I talked about that one of the ideological cores of our civilization, of Western civilization, is genetics. You know, we have basically a genetic political structure, right? So it's based on ideas like monarchy and patriarchy, which are about inborn differences between organisms that are genetic origin, right? So historically, the political structure in Europe was based on monarchy. And that's all about the genetic superiority of the family, and then that's then passed on to the children, and so on and so forth, right? So this idea of, you know, the nation, the race, the family, the elite, the genetic elites, this is kind of imbued into our political structures, and is based on a false, ultimately, it's based on a false idea of what genetics actually is.
Yeah, I was looking at some of the information on the internet, and I came across the Wikipedia site that said that you actually feel that with regards to diseases today, that they are not genetically originated.
Yeah.
And can you explain that a little bit more? Yeah,
for sure. So I'm a molecular biologist, right? DNA is a real molecule. It has a role in biology. It's one of the things that you pass on to your children, right? So this is, I don't want people to be confused into thinking that I don't think DNA is actually a molecule. But what is going on is that we are projecting, as biologists and also members of the public, we're projecting properties onto that DNA, which basically don't exist. It's kind of like, if you imagine how this might have happened in the Middle Ages, right? The king, is implying that his family has these genetic properties that he's going to pass on to his firstborn son, that of social graces and of intelligence and God-fearingness, or whatever it is, all the properties that are considered to reside in that family. That essentially, modern genetics, modern biology would say this family is no different from any other family that existed in that society at that time, but the difference was that the entirety of the society projected that there was a difference, right? Everybody understood, and we do that, and it's kind of a microcosm of what we do with DNA. We talk about, for example, as molecular biologists, people may have heard the word gene expression, right? Gene expression is a metaphor for how genes function in cells, and the bottom line is that genes don't express themselves. They don't have opinions. They don't smile or laugh or grimace or whatever. They don't do any of those things. They're part of a system, and the organism is a system. But what we do in biology is we impute agency on the part of that DNA, right? We pretend that all the properties of the organism are actually properties of the DNA. And we do this in many, many different ways that probably it would take too long to go into really in this conversation. But we do this all the time in not only as scientists, but also as lay people. And that's what this, a whole business of monarchy is about that. A large part of science is about that. And so we're building up this story of DNA and around DNA and about how society is and about how organisms are. That is essentially, there's a fiction, and it comes and it expresses itself, for example, in the Human Genome Project, in which we imagined that all these illnesses like heart disease and diabetes and Alzheimer's disease, all the way through to mental health issues like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, we just have this expectation that these illnesses come from, in large part, from a genetic source. And it's not true, right? Yeah. What the Human Genome Project has basically shown us is that it's not true. It was a projection all along. And we've now proven it, but the problem with the scientific establishment is they've invested so much in this idea that it's very hard for them at this point to backtrack and actually accept that essentially the research is basically disproven it. Mm-hmm. It's hard for them because for many, many reasons. But one of them is, one of them is they put hundreds of billions of dollars into it. Right, according to my calculations, something like $200 billion has been spent, and this is medical research money, right? Money that could have been spent to cure cancer and cure all these diseases has been spent on looking for genetic predisposition.
Right. So what's come out now is that epigenetics is the real reason. Well, of course, there are other factors too. There is some genetic predisposition, but the environmental factors. The way we're raised, what we eat, the air, the water that we're exposed to have enormous influence on who we are and what diseases we develop.
Yeah, I mean, part of the attraction of all these genetic ideas has always been that they feed back into the establishment's view of itself, right? And one of those establishment views of themselves is that, pollution, for example, is not part of our health problem. Yeah. But, stress and pollution and all these insults that our bodies receive on a basically minute-to-minute basis are, emerging as by far the obvious candidates for the causation of all these diseases. But the establishment doesn't really want to admit that. No. Right? Because this has all kinds of policy implications and criminal implications and all kinds of things follow from that. Mm-hmm. Right? So you have all this politics that's bound up with the understanding of DNA. And my interpretation of epigenetics is actually that what the establishment is doing, and this is a fact, right? That there's been relatively little research on epigenetics. But they've nevertheless committed, really large sums of money to the study of this, right? And it's exactly like genetics, without really having much of an evidence base beyond a vague surmise, you throw $200 billion at a problem, a medical problem, and they're in the process of repeating that with epigenetics, right? They don't actually have the evidence base. No. There's these tiny little kind of subtle hints that there may be epigenetics may explain some of our illnesses, but the bottom line is that evidence is only barely emerging, and to the extent that it has emerged, it's not really clear that that's a very strong contributor, and so. But my thinking is that what they imagine is that there are people in the National Institutes of Health, for example, who understand perfectly well that their genetic thesis is failing. Right? They know the maths. They can read the results of the studies, and so epigenetics for them is their way of supporting an idea that sounds to the public like genetics. That this is merely, it was a confounding thing, but it's kind of like genetics really, and that essentially is a kind of red herring, right? You can't. It's hard to justify still throwing all that money at genetics. But if they throw to epigenetics, they can kind of move away from their paradigm, or at least keep that ball in the air while they think what to do next, basically.
Yeah. So the research can continue if they get the funding.
Yeah.
And so that seems to be the bottom line, even at universities, that you can continue to be in the profession if you have the money that is given to you by whomever, whether it's chemical companies or corporations or private donors, that allow you to do research on something which probably or possibly will never even come to anything concrete.
Yeah, this is very common. People have this understanding that science is a kind of bottom-up profession, right? Individual scientists some of them are great innovators, and they come up with these great ideas, and then when they do that, then people give them money.
Yes.
That is a thing that happens, but for the most part, the establishment, decides they're going to give money to genetic research rather than curing cancer, or to agribusiness developments rather than organic farming, and so on and so forth. So the most research is controlled from the top down, right? So there's already an agenda of digitizing this, or big data projects, or if, we're going to put more into one field of, like, for example, a big field in biology is trying to connect human brains to machines, right? Huge amounts of money is thrown at that idea because, the military see that as a big thing. So there are various people who think that there will be innovation around that and so forth. And it's kind of sold to the public often as a story of, we can help poor vets, disabled vets or disabled children. But that's not really the motivation behind it. Right? The motivation behind it is militaristic and technological, and about, fusing people with their cars and so on and so forth. The most of those agendas are not that lovely to think about.
So not that noble as we are led to believe that science can provide.
No, I mean, it often may come from the health budget, or the scientific research, the pure scientific research budget. But there's always an idea behind it, and just like in our society, where public money gets thrown at projects that we don't all agree with, this is what happens in science.
Yeah. So when you found that you weren't really doing what drew you to the profession and to the field to begin with, you got out of it and you created a nonprofit organization.
Yeah.
And that allows you to have a more educational purpose and a lot more freedom to express yourself and collect people around you who have a similar philosophy.
Yeah, I mean, freedom is a key thing in all this. And, I didn't see myself, as you say, being bound into the scientific process with all the restrictions there are on that. And, there are, the other side of the coin is that many researchers who have ideas similar to ours, they live in fear of their administrations. Right, and attracting the ire of multinational corporations and so on and so forth. So these people often feel that they cannot say what they'd like to say. Yeah. They cannot even, some of them feel like they can't shake my hand or have a conversation with me because they're so fearful. Right,
because they'll be associated with your thinking.
Yeah.
That's unfortunate. Yeah. Well,
it's disastrous, right, for our democracy.
I don't know how much of a democracy we have anymore, but we try to keep speaking the truth. You've had a certain amount of time here in Hawaii, which is your first time.
Yeah.
And can you give us an impression of what you've seen and how it relates to what you've been studying all these years and trying to bring out to the people?
I mean, it's been a steep learning curve, interestingly, here. I didn't know about many of the political situations that are fairly local to Hawaii, and what I see is, on the agribusiness front, for example, you see all these stories of spray drift and of people being harmed, and I've met a number of people who've had these experiences repeatedly because of where they live in proximity to fields and farms and so forth. And you see the impact of spray drift, for example, on the neighbors, right? Their ability to function as farmers, their ability to go to school. It's clear that this is a big problem on the islands, even if it's denied by the EPA and the local officials and so on and so forth. The stories that I hear make me think that this is, and the pictures that I've seen, right? Not only stories, but pretty solid evidence, as far as I'm concerned, that this is really a major problem. And it's, to me, it's hard to imagine it's not impacting significantly on people's health, depending on where you live.
Yeah, considering that Hawaii is based on agriculture way back 100 years ago, where we developed sugarcane and pineapple as a source of income, and people were brought in to work in those fields, totally oblivious to the harm that those chemicals could do and did do. which is now showing up in the third generation as health issues, infertility, etc. So I think many of us are still quite ignorant of the harm that chemicals can do, because we've been told by science that you need the chemicals in order to be able to provide food for people.
Yeah. I mean, the EPA, for example, does a terrible job of trying to get to the bottom of these issues. Mm-hmm. Right? I'm here in part on this island to talk about the story of the poison papers.
Yes.
Which I think you're going to ask me about at some point. But one of the really interesting take-home messages, and this is something I talked about in Kauai in a talk, is that there's this gap. Like EPA was told about the toxicological consequences of dioxins, which are basically industrial contaminants of chemical processes. They were told about that, and they basically have sat on their hands for 50 years. Mm-hmm. They were told about it in 1970. They've basically done nothing except in 2010 they produced a document which is basically draft guidance on how to clean up Superfund sites from dioxins. So that draft document took them 40 years to actually, from being informed to actually publishing it. 40 years. The chemical industry, right? They figured out that dioxins were incredibly harmful in the 1950s, and there's a document in those papers which demonstrates how Monsanto wrote to one of the chemical companies in Germany, and they describe an experiment which took them basically 2 weeks to conduct, which showed them beyond any reasonable doubt that these were astoundingly poisonous compounds.
Yeah.
Right? So EPA has access to all this information. It could do the same experiments. It could have done any number of things. But essentially, what took the chemical industry 2 weeks rather, to figure out has taken EPA, even just to make a vague, helpful initial document, 40 years. Right? So they have no enthusiasm for figuring out the chemical harm that we're subjected to.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about why the EPA was created.
Yeah. So the key person here was two key people, right? Rachel Carson and Richard Nixon. So Rachel Carson was, creating this impetus around toxic chemicals. And this was, exacerbated by issues in Vietnam around Agent Orange, and she had her book, Silent Spring, and she was agitating. And essentially what Richard Nixon needed was an agency to basically buffer the chemical industry from the outraged citizens. And so what he did is create the EPA, which was basically by putting together what were essentially separate operations coming from different departments, including, for example, the USDA. Mm-hmm. So he put them together into one single agency that was then presented to the public as the solution to these problems. And what happened was it took the wind out of the sails of the environmental movement, because if the public, many members of the public believe that the EPA is doing the job, then they don't need to be involved. Right. And that illusion has been maintained for 40 years now, yes. 50 years. In fact, we're just approaching the 50th birthday. In 2020 will be the 50th birthday of the EPA. And they have basically done nothing, is what the poison papers say. Yeah. They have approved fraudulent testing and so on, and we'll talk about that.
Yeah, it's quite criminal when you come down to it.
Absolutely.
And we would probably do our country a favor with taxpayers' dollars to disband the EPA. But is anybody about to do that?
Well, this kind of request, right, that could be made. Right, if we are better off actually without them, right, as some whistleblowers argue, then that would be a request. Mm-hmm. And at the very least, if the government, if the environmental movement made that request, then the government would actually have to do something about that request, if it was made strongly enough, but also put the agency itself on notice, right, that they don't stand for the forces of rationality and precaution and public safety that we recognize that they are part of the problem.
Yeah.
They're not part of the solution at
Right.
this point. And there were people, who joined the EPA who in all conscience believed at the time that the agency was going to do that job.
Yes.
Right? A vast majority of the population probably believed at that point that the EPA would function. But those people ended up leaving or becoming whistleblowers, so far as I can tell.
Yeah. So basically, EPA is there to protect itself and allow those employees to continue to have that job.
Yeah, and the chemical industry, right?
Right.
Because if we had to take, at this point, if we had to take Monsanto's word that its own products were safe, or Dow's own word that its products were safe, we probably wouldn't use those chemicals, right? If it wasn't for the existence of the EPA, most of us would just say, thanks, I'll drink out of glass.
Right. So there's a lot more to be discussed about the chemical issue, so we will continue that in part 2. And it's really phenomenal that you are so brave to speak out in the way that you're doing. What we need is more environmental groups that do not have their own agenda, which may be a co-optation of the true purpose of saving the environment. So that is something that we have to look at more closely too.
Yeah.
Okay, any last words?
So, well, I mean, as you suggest, it is obvious that plenty of environmental groups, especially the bigger ones, are co-opted by the industries that they claim to confront. You have these big non-profits, like the Nature Conservancy and the World Wildlife Fund, whose boards are filled with CEOs and senior executives from anywhere from Starbucks to Goldman Sachs to insurance companies to PR companies. Basically anybody who thinks that the environmental movement might be a threat to them puts their people on the boards of these groups. So, there was a boycott against Starbucks, so Starbucks put their people on the board of some of these big non-profits. And now these big non-profits no longer organize boycotts.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for being here, and we'll continue shortly.
My pleasure.
Thank you.